to the second video in the series, which is focusing on plagiarism. Now, why do we have a video dedicated specifically to plagiarism? It's because it's the most common pitfall for law students. It's the type of academic integrity breach that most frequently arises in applications for admission. And it's a pretty tricky thing to navigate in your first few weeks at law schools. So this video is going to explore the different types of plagiarism in detail, looking at some examples, and we will also be looking at some tips for avoiding plagiarism.
So plagiarism involves representing to the reader that the work is your original work or idea. In essence, it involves passing off someone's work or idea as your own. In failing to properly acknowledge the source of that particular quote or line or passage or paragraph, in failing to acknowledge the source, you represent to the reader that it's your original work or idea. Note that it does not require proof of intention. It's sufficient that you represent someone else's work or idea as your own through failing to acknowledge the original source. It's possible to plagiarize diagrams and creative works like film and photography. If you are enrolled in a double degree and you're using things like data or formula or coding or designs, it's possible to also plagiarize those. So it's important to act with integrity and be robust about what sources you are using for all of your university assessments. So what you can now see on the slide are the 4 ways in which a student may commit plagiarism. The first is by directly quoting words from the original text without indicating to the reader that this is a direct quote in accordance with the relevant referencing guide. Alternatively, you may commit plagiarism by directly quoting the original text and then failing to acknowledge the source. So in that instance, you may have used quotation marks, but there's no reference to the source and it's not possible to ascertain where those words have been sourced from. The second way in which you may commit plagiarism is by summarizing work and then failing to acknowledge the source. Summarizing involves taking the key concepts from a text and placing them into your own words. This of course means that the original idea is still there and it belongs to someone else, so it should be acknowledged even though it is expressed in your own voice. Paraphrasing involves taking a piece of text and deleting bits or adding bits to it, and maybe even using synonyms to express the same idea. Again, the original idea is still there and you must acknowledge the source. And you'll see number 4 on the slide there is really a catch-all. It's designed to represent a situation in which you have used someone else's work or someone else's idea and you have failed to acknowledge that source. Because of course, in so doing, you represent to the reader that it's your work, it's your original work or idea, when in fact you have taken it from somewhere else. So what we're going to do now is look at those first 3 in more detail. Where you wish to directly quote another's work, so you wish to in effect copy and paste part of their work into your own work, you need to ensure that you do 2 things. The first is to provide a full reference to the source, including a pinpoint reference, so that the reader can locate those exact words in the source. Secondly, you must indicate to the reader that it is a direct quote in accordance with the relevant rules in the AGLC. Now, the AGLC distinguishes between short quotes and long quotes. So if the quote is 3 lines or less in length, we use single quotation marks around the text that has been copied from the original source. If it is a long quote, so 4 or more lines, then in that instance we do not use quotation marks at all. Instead, we indent the text from the left margin and use smaller text size. So by making the text size smaller and tabbing it in from the left hand side, that indicates to the reader that it is a direct quote. Where you decide that you would like to quote more than once from the same source, make sure that you place a footnote at the end of every quote. It's not good enough to cite the source once in the paper. Each time that you use that source, so each time that you quote directly from it, you must provide a footnote with a reference that includes the pinpoint reference to where within the source those words can be found. So this is an example of a student's essay which includes a long quotation. You can see that the student has provided an introduction or a small passage that leads into the long quote, which is here. This is the quote from Butler's work. So what you can see is that it's indented from the left margin, so it's tabbed in from the margin, and you can also see that it's in a smaller font size to the rest of the student's essay. In addition, there is a footnote following the end of the direct quote, and you can see here that the full citation for this journal article has been provided in the footnote, including this pinpoint reference. So you can see that there's no quotation marks where it's a long quote. If it's a short quote, as I said earlier, use single quotation marks. We don't use double when quoting in accordance with the AGLC. Let's move on to looking at paraphrasing. Paraphrasing involves rephrasing the original text or altering the way the original source is expressed through things like deleting words or adding words or using synonyms for words. So I've got an example on the slide here. So on the left hand side we have the original text, which is taken from Des Butler's article in 2019. On the top right there you can see the paraphrased text. So that's the student's attempt at rephrasing the original text into the student's own words. So take a moment to pause the video and read the original text first and then the paraphrased text so that you can understand the extent to which the paraphrased text is different. Now what you should have hopefully seen from the comparison of the original to the paraphrased is that the key thoughts or ideas in the original text are still there in the paraphrased text, and that of course means that we must acknowledge the source because we are still using someone else's idea. Now what I've done on the bottom right of the slide is to illustrate the way that the student has paraphrased the original text. The strike-throughs are where those words have been deleted, and the red indicates where new words or punctuation have been added. This should help you visualize the extent to which the student has modified the original text. So again, pause the video, read the original text, and then have a look at the paraphrased version that indicates how the student has paraphrased that original text. Now what you can hopefully see here is that there's been quite a lot of amendment to that first section of the student's work. There's been quite a lot of red, i.e. new words inserted, quite a lot of deletion of the original text. However, the key idea that is being expressed is still the same as that expressed in Des Butler's original work. So it does need an acknowledgement of that source. But take a look at the second part where it starts with there should also be. So there should also be a means of real-time tracking of drones. Have a look at that and then consider whether that is really a paraphrase source or whether or not there's still a direct quote there. So what we can see there is there should also be a is really just part of expressing the sentence, but the main components of the sentence which tell us the story or the original idea, which is real-time tracking of drones, still remains. That's identical to what was in the previous original version. Really, that's a direct quote. It's a very short one, but it's a direct quote of the original text. There's been no alteration to that latter part of the sentence. So that's really not paraphrasing, that's just lifting directly from the original text. The other part of the paragraph, however, is paraphrasing, because we can see that there's been substantial deletion, there's been the insertion of new words, and the sentence structure has also been changed. So two things to take away from this slide. The first is that the first part of this paragraph still needs to acknowledge the source because the idea comes from somewhere else. It comes from Des Butler's 2019 article. And the second part of this passage actually needs to be directly quoted, because the phrase means of a real-time tracking of drones has just been lifted from the original text. So let's have a look at how we acknowledge that original source in the paraphrase version on the next slide. So on this slide, again, we've got the original text on the left-hand side and the paraphrase version on the right. What you can see here is that the first section, which if you remember is paraphrased to an acceptable degree, still contains that original idea that belongs to Des Butler, so the student needs to have a footnote at the end of the sentence. Now if there were, say, 3 sentences and all of those reflected Des Butler's original article and include some components of that work or idea expressed in that article, you would need a footnote for every sentence. Every time you use someone else's work or idea, you must place a footnote at the end of the sentence. So here we've got footnote 1, and you can see that the full citation of the source is provided in footnote 1 with a pinpoint reference back to that original idea, so where that can be located within Des Butler's article. And then here we've got the second sentence. Now if you remember from the previous slide, this part where the quotation mark begins was directly lifted and hadn't been amended or paraphrased. So we need to acknowledge that that is a direct quote, and in this case it's a short quotation, it's only 1 line long, so the AGLC requires that we use single quotation marks in that instance. So where the quote is 3 lines or less in length, we use single quotation marks like we have done here. And again, at the end of the quote, you must have a footnote reference and a full citation in the footnote, including the pinpoint reference. Now in this instance, the footnote reference is identical to the first one, so footnotes 2 and 1 are both the same, so we can actually use IBID in that situation. The AGLC permits us to use IBID to refer to the immediately preceding source. However, if they were different, then you would need to make sure you've got the full citation and the pinpoint reference where that quote can be found. Moving on to summarizing, which is the third type of plagiarism that is frequently seen in students' work. Summarizing involves capturing the key points from a passage of text or from the original source. So using a quote from Des Butler's article that we discussed in relation to paraphrasing, what is on the slide there is now a summary, so the student's summary of the key points in that particular passage of text. Pause the video now and have a read of this student's summary. Now note that you can rewind to the previous slide if you wanted to refresh your memory of the original text. Now here what you can see is that the student is really adding value to the original passage. There's additional commentary that the student puts in there. In many cases, what the original text said has been extended or refined or advanced, but the key ideas that come across in the original text are still present in parts of this student's work. What that means is that the student must acknowledge that the ideas are not the student's own, they come from Butler's work. Now, as you can see here, the student acknowledges Butler right at the beginning by saying Butler argues that. However, that is not sufficient for acknowledgement of the source. We actually need the full reference to the source. So let's have a look now at how we should acknowledge that aspects of this paragraph come from Butler's article. So here you can see that there are 2 footnotes, one at the end of the first sentence and one at the end of the second sentence. We have had to use 2 footnotes here because each sentence contains a component that is extracted from the original source. So each sentence contains part of Butler's work or ideas. So every time that you use someone else's ideas or someone else's work, even if it's summarizing their work, you must acknowledge the source. That means that you might need to refer to the source multiple times throughout your work. It's certainly not sufficient to just cite the source once and that's the end of it. So here the student has acknowledged that aspects of this first sentence include some of Butler's work, there is a footnote reference at the end of that sentence, and then the full citation of the source with a pinpoint reference referring back to where that idea can be located in the original source. At the end of the second sentence, the student also knows again that some of this here summarizes key concepts in Butler's work. So there's another footnote and again a separate footnote in the source. Now again, because it's the identical source to the immediately preceding footnote, we can use IBID, but if it were a different journal article, then you'd need to provide the full citation here as well. So we've now looked at the first 3 types of plagiarism on the slide there. Note that there is a 4th type, which is really a catch-all. It's using another's work or idea without acknowledging the source. Remember that plagiarism isn't just in relation to the written word. You can plagiarize diagrams, you can plagiarize coding, data, creative works like film and photography, and you can also self-plagiarize, where you attempt to submit work that you have previously presented in a previous assessment item. Note that plagiarism can be committed unintentionally. It occurs where someone presents work as their own when in fact it incorporates someone else's work or idea without acknowledging the source. However, intentional plagiarism will be treated much more seriously than where the plagiarism is inadvertent. So let's now have a look at some tips for avoiding plagiarism. So our first tip is to evaluate each sentence that you have written and ascertain whether or not your work has been informed by someone else's work or idea. If that's the case, you will need a reference and the full citation in the footnotes. I think it's really important that you try and engage in full referencing as you're note-taking. So before you even start your first draft of your assignment, as you're taking notes, even when you're doing notes for lectures or for workshops, use full citation even at that point. It's going to make it much easier for you to transfer information into your essays if you've got the full reference there. So when you're taking notes or when you're drafting an assignment and you want to quote a passage of text directly, make sure that you carefully follow the AGLC. As we discussed earlier, there are 2 different ways depending on how long the quote is. Now, when summarizing or paraphrasing, make sure that you again insert the full citation as you write, whether that's in notes or whether that's in an actual assignment, and try and comply with the AGLC as you write because it will just save you time at the editing stage. In addition to getting into the habit of citing full references as you make notes and as you draft your assignments, it's also important to ensure that you do not copy directly from the source into your notes or your draft document. What we mean by that is, if you don't intend to quote something, don't copy it word for word, because that whole copy-paste thing is so easy to do and then it's so easy to forget. If you go and make a cup of tea and then come back, so easy to forget that you've copied that word for word into your assignment. Instead, try and summarize or paraphrase and make sure that once you've completed paraphrasing or summarizing a particular part of the text, that you insert your references before you move away from your desk and go and make that cup of tea. Now, when it comes to editing your work, never remove references to sources in the footnotes. So where you've already prepared your document, you're editing it in full, don't take out any footnote referencing that you have done unless you have decided to completely delete any content from the original source. What we see quite often is that students might take a quote out, for example, and then assume that they can delete all of the relevant references to that particular source, but there may still be summarizing or paraphrasing throughout a couple of paragraphs. So it's really important to pay attention to the footnotes and whether they reflect that you have used someone else's idea or work in a portion of your essay. Now, also when editing your work, it's important to check whether or not you have included all the sources that you originally identified in your plan or your notes as being relevant to the assessment task. If there is a gap between the two and there are sources missing in your in your draft, that may indicate that you've skipped some of the acknowledgement of the original work. So what these tips are really telling us is that it's important to be systematic. We need to research our sources carefully, keeping a log as we do so. When we're making notes, we need to constantly make sure that we're noting where we've extracted that information from and that we have full referencing. And it's important to ensure that when you're translating that into an assignment, that your referencing accurately reflects what you've extracted from the relevant texts. So clearly it's about being logical and having systems in place to prevent inadvertent plagiarism. It will take you a while to work out what system works best for you, but it's important to make sure you have a system in place to protect yourself so that you can avoid any plagiarism or academic integrity breaches on your record, because of course they are relevant to your application for admission as a lawyer. So this brings us to the end of this video in the series. There is a final third video on referencing. It will look at the AGLC in detail and provide you with an introduction to the basic rules, which you will need for when you have to complete assessments across all your units in your first year at law school.